The ship fell from the sky like a wounded bird, trailing smoke and fire across the Montana evening sky. And inside the cockpit, Zeth Kalor fought against the failing controls with all 3,000 years of his experience. He had conquered worlds, burned civilizations to ash, and walked through the flames of 100 battles without fear. But now his ancient warship was dying around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The engines screamed one final time before the vessel crashed into the mountainside with a sound like thunder, tearing through pine trees and carving a scar across the earth that stretched for nearly a mile. When the noise finally stopped, Zeth Kalor lay among the wreckage of what had once been the most feared scout ship in the Neth Dominion fleet, his obsidian scales cracked and bleeding, his left arm twisted at an angle that would have killed any lesser being. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey, and for the first time in centuries, the Dragon of Neth Prime felt something close to fear. The emergency beacon had been destroyed in the crash, and his communication systems were nothing but melted metal and sparking wires, which meant no rescue would come, which meant he was stranded on this primitive backwater planet with its soft pink creatures who had not even mastered faster-than-light travel. He would die here, among the trees and the dirt, alone and forgotten, and his enemies across the galaxy would celebrate when they learned of his fate. But death did not come that night. Instead, two figures appeared at the edge of the crater his ship had created, their shapes silhouetted against the fading light of the setting sun. One was a male human, tall and weathered, with gray streaking through his brown hair, and he carried a bag over his shoulder that clinked with metal instruments. The other was younger, a female with bright red hair pulled back from her face, and she held a flashlight that cut through the growing darkness like a tiny star. "Holy cow," the younger one said, her voice carrying across the destruction. "Dad, are you seeing this?" The older human, whose name Zeth Kalor would later learn was Ben Carter, walked carefully down the slope of churned earth toward the wreckage, and his daughter Katie followed close behind, despite his warnings to stay back. Zeth Kalor watched them approach through eyes that were growing dim, and he gathered what little strength he had left for one final strike. Because a warrior of the Dominion did not die helpless. A warrior of the Dominion took his enemies with him into the darkness. But when Ben Carter finally reached him and knelt down in the dirt beside his broken body, the human did not attack. Instead, he opened his bag and began pulling out bandages and bottles and tools that Zeth Kalor did not recognize. "Easy there, big fella," Ben said, in a voice that was calm and gentle. Kind of voice one might use with a frightened animal. "I know you probably want to bite my head off right now, but I spent 40 years fixing up creatures that wanted to bite my head off. So let us just skip that part and get you patched up." Zeth Kalor tried to speak, tried to warn this foolish creature that he was addressing the most decorated executioner in Dominion history. But all that came out was a low growl that made Katie take a step backward. "He is hurt bad," Katie said, crouching down beside her father. "Look at his arm, and there is blood everywhere. At least I think it is blood." "Grab the large bandages from the truck," Ben said, without looking up, his hands already moving across Zeth Kalor's wounds with a practiced efficiency. "And bring the whole first aid kit, the big one we keep for the horses." Katie ran off into the darkness, and Zeth Kalor found himself staring at this strange human who showed no fear, who treated the Dragon of Neth Prime like just another injured animal on his property. "Why?" Zeth Kalor managed to ask, the human language feeling clumsy and wrong in his mouth, though his translator implant provided the words. Ben paused and looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, no terror, only a quiet compassion that Zeth Kalor had never seen directed at anything in his entire existence. "Because you are hurt," Ben said simply, "and I help things that are hurt. It is what I do." This made no sense to Zeth Kalor, and he decided that the crash must have damaged his translator, because surely no being in the universe would help an enemy without expecting something in return. Katie returned with supplies, and the two humans worked through the night to stabilize his wounds, speaking to each other in quiet voices, and occasionally speaking to him as well, telling him what they were doing, warning him when something would sting, praising him when he held still. By dawn, Zeth Kalor was wrapped in more bandages than scales, but he was alive, and the bleeding had stopped, and the humans had carried him somehow to a small building, filled with cages and animals and the smell of medicine. "This is our rescue sanctuary," Katie explained, as she arranged blankets around him in a large stall that had probably been built for horses. "We take care of animals that nobody else wants, the ones that are sick or hurt or just too mean for anyone else to handle." She grinned at him then, a fearless expression that showed all her teeth. "I guess you fit right in," she said. Zeth Kalor said nothing, because he was already planning their deaths, calculating how long it would take for his strength to return, deciding which one he would kill first, and how he would escape this primitive world once he had recovered. The girl was young and weak, and would pose no threat. The father was older, and moved with the careful slowness of a creature past its prime. He would wait until he had the chance, was healed, and then he would do what he had done on 200 worlds before this one. He would destroy these creatures who had dared to touch him, and he would find a way to signal the Dominion for rescue, and he would continue his eternal mission of conquest and execution. This was his purpose, his reason for existence, the only thing he had known for 30 centuries. But as he lay there in the straw and the morning light, watching Ben Carter limp out to feed the other animals, and listening to Katie hum a strange melody while she cleaned the medical tools, Zeth Kalor felt something he could not name stirring in the depths of his ancient heart. It was small and weak, and entirely unfamiliar, and he crushed it down immediately, because warriors of the Dominion did not feel such things. Warriors of the Dominion felt only the cold fire of duty and the hot satisfaction of victory. Still, as the days passed and his wounds slowly healed, refused to die completely, and Zeth Kalor began to suspect that crashing on this strange world might change him in ways he was not prepared to understand. 3 weeks had passed since the crash, and Zeth Kalor remained trapped at the Carter Sanctuary, his body healing far more slowly than he had expected due to the strange composition of Earth's atmosphere. His emergency beacon was beyond repair, and his ship was nothing more than scattered debris that the humans had covered with large sheets of fabric to hide it from the eyes of their flying machines. He was a prisoner here, though his captors did not seem to realize they were keeping him captive, and each day brought new observations that confused and frustrated him in equal measure. Ben Carter woke every morning before the sun and spent his first hours caring for the animals in his sanctuary, mixing medicines and preparing food and cleaning the spaces where the creatures lived. There was a dog with only 3 legs that Ben carried outside each morning so it could feel the grass beneath its remaining paws, and there was a cat that was blind in both eyes that Ben cared for, spoke to in soft tones while he changed its bandages, and there was an old horse that could barely walk that Ben brushed and fed and treated like it was the most valuable creature on the planet. None of this made any sense to Zeth Kalor. In the Dominion, weakness was death, and resources were never wasted on those who could not contribute to the greater purpose of conquest. A 3-legged dog would be destroyed immediately because it could not hunt or guard or serve any useful function, and a blind cat was simply food being consumed without return, and an old horse that could not work was nothing but a burden. Yet Ben Carter spent hours each day on these worthless creatures, and when Zeth Kalor finally demanded to know why, the humans simply shrugged and said that every life deserved dignity. "They did not ask to be broken," Ben said while changing the bandages on Zeth Kalor's arm, "and being broken does not mean they do not deserve love." No response to this, because love was not a concept that existed in the Netheri language, and the closest translation his implant could provide was something like tactical alliance, which clearly was not what the human meant. Katie was even more confusing than her father. She treated Zethkalor as though he were a new friend, rather than an alien creature who had planned to kill her entire species, bringing him books to read and music to listen to, and asking him endless questions about his home and his travels and his life among the stars. One afternoon she found a small bird lying beneath a tree with a broken wing, and she carried it inside with tears streaming down her face, begging her father to save it. They worked for 3 hours trying to help the tiny creature, but in the end, its injuries were too severe, and it died in Katie's hands, while she whispered words of comfort to it. Zethkalor watched the girl weep over a bird that weighed less than one of his scales, and he felt that strange stirring in his chest again, that nameless emotion he had been trying so hard to suppress. "Why do you cry?" he asked her later that evening. The bird was small and weak, and of no value to anyone. Katie looked at him with red eyes and a fierce expression. "Everything has value," she said. "Every life matters, even the small ones, especially the small ones, because nobody else is looking out for them." He began keeping a log of human behaviors that he labeled irrational, recording each instance of what he called the human defect, in hopes of understanding this strange species. A man named Danny Cole worked at the fire station in the nearby town, and one night, Zethkalor watched through the sanctuary window as lights and sirens filled the darkness. The next morning, Ben told him that Danny had run into a burning building to save a cat that belonged to a stranger, suffering serious burns on his arms and face in the process. "He nearly died for an animal that was not even his," Zethkalor said, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. "That is just who Danny is," Ben replied. "He has been that way since we were kids." There was a nurse named Amy Dawson who worked at the clinic in town, and Katie told Zethkalor about how Amy stayed late every night without extra payment to sit with patients who were dying so they would not have to face the end alone. "She holds their hands and talks to them and makes sure they know someone cares," Katie said with admiration in her voice. "Even when their own families are not there, Amy is there." Zethkalor added this to his log under the heading Illogical Expenditure of Resources, because time spent with the dying could be spent helping the living, and in the Dominion the dying were left to die quickly so they would not slow the march of progress. A group of young humans spent an entire summer building a ramp beside the home of an elderly man named Mr. Patterson so that he could move his wheeled chair in and out of his dwelling more easily. They received no payment for this work. They were not related to the old man. They simply did it because they saw someone struggling and wanted to help. "This species will not survive," Zethkalor muttered to himself as he recorded this observation. "They waste everything on those who cannot repay them, and they prioritize emotion over efficiency, and they treat weakness as something to be protected rather than eliminated." But even as he wrote these words, he found himself watching the three-legged dog chase a ball across the yard, its tail wagging with pure joy despite its missing limb. And he found himself listening to Ben hum while he worked, content in his purpose of caring for broken things. And he found himself looking forward to Katie's visits, her bright voice and endless curiosity the only interruption to his otherwise silent. The neighbors came by often, bringing food they called casseroles and offering help with tasks around the sanctuary. And Ben always invited them inside for something called coffee while they talked about weather and sports and the small details of their ordinary lives. When Ben's truck broke down one morning, 3 different families arrived within hours to offer assistance, and by sunset the vehicle was running again, and Ben had not paid anyone a single currency unit. "We look out for each other around here," one of the neighbors explained when he caught Zethkalor watching from the window. "That is just how it is." Zethkalor wanted to dismiss all of this as the foolishness of a primitive species. wanted to maintain his certainty that the Nethari way of strength and conquest was superior to this soft existence of mutual aid and irrational compassion. But late at night, when the sanctuary was quiet and the stars he had once sailed between shone through his window, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to live among beings who helped each other without calculation, who cried over dying birds, who ran into flames for creatures they had never met. He wondered, and that wondering frightened him more than any battle ever had. The fire came without warning on a hot afternoon in late summer, racing down from the mountains with a speed that caught everyone by surprise. Ben had driven into town that morning to pick up medical supplies, and Katie was alone at the sanctuary when the first clouds of smoke appeared on the horizon, dark and angry against the blue sky. Zethkalor smelled it before he saw it, the sharp scent of burning wood and dry grass triggering ancient instincts that had kept him alive through countless battles. He walked outside and stood at the edge of the property, watching the wall of flame advance across the distant hills, calculating its speed and direction with the practiced eye of a warrior. The fire would reach the sanctuary within 2 hours, perhaps less if the wind increased. He had a choice to make. His body had healed enough for travel, and the mountains to the north offered safety from the flames, and once the fire passed, he could search for a way. To contact the Dominion, or simply wait for a patrol ship to detect his life signs. Katie and her animals would die, but that was the nature of existence in a hostile universe, and the strong survived while the weak perished, and this had been the way of things since the first stars were born. He took 3 steps toward the northern tree line before stopping. Behind him he could hear Katie calling out to the animals, her voice tight with fear as she tried to figure out what to do, and he could hear the dogs barking and the horses stamping nervously in their stalls. The girl was 16 years old and had never faced anything like this, and her father was miles away and might not return in time, and she was trying to save creatures that could not save themselves. Zethkalor stood frozen between the trees and the sanctuary, between escape and something he did not have a word for. He thought of Katie bringing him books during his recovery, for hours, even though he had barely spoken to her, treating him with kindness that he had never earned. He thought of Ben wrapping his wounds with gentle hands, saying that helping hurt things was simply what he did, expecting nothing in return. He thought of the 3-legged dog that ran with such joy, despite everything it had lost, and the dying bird that Katie had wept over as though its small life had meaning. And he turned around. Katie was trying to load the smaller animals into cages when Zethkalor appeared beside her, his massive form blocking the light from the open door. "We need to move them to the east fields," she said without hesitation, as though having a 7-foot alien warrior help with animal rescue was perfectly normal. "There is a creek there that might slow the fire down." "The creek will not stop it," Zethkalor said. "The wind is pushing the flames too fast." Katie's face fell, and for a moment she looked like what she was, frightened child, facing something far beyond her ability to control. "Then what do we do?" Zethkalor had burned worlds. He had walked through firestorms that would have reduced any human to ash in seconds, his scales absorbing heat that would melt steel, his body built to withstand the weapons of interstellar war. "Get the animals to the creek," he said. "I will slow the fire." He did not wait for her response before running toward the approaching flames, his clawed feet tearing up the dry ground as he moved faster than any human could follow. The fire was a living thing, hungry and relentless, consuming everything in its path with a roar that drowned out all other sound. Zethkalor reached the edge of the blaze and began to work, tearing up strips of earth to create barriers that the flames could not easily cross, using his own body to smother smaller fires before they could spread, directing the main wall of flame away from the sanctuary through sheer physical force. The heat was intense, even for him, his scales cracking in places where the fire burned hottest. But he did not stop. He thought of nothing but the girl and her father, and the broken animals they had chosen to protect. And he pushed himself harder than he had pushed himself in centuries. Back at the sanctuary, Katie worked with desperate speed, loading cages into her father's old truck and leading the horses on foot toward the eastern creek, her lungs burning from the smoke that was beginning to fill the air. She could see Zethkalor in the distance, a dark shape moving through the orange and red of the fire, and she did not understand what she was watching, but she knew somehow that he was saving them. The wind shifted suddenly, pushing a wall of flame directly toward the sanctuary with terrifying speed. Zethkalor saw it and ran, covering the distance between himself and Katie in seconds, and he reached her just as the fire crested the hill above them. He did the only thing he could think to do. He wrapped his massive body around hers, shielding her with his scales, pressing her down into the dirt as the flames roared over them, like a wave crashing against a rock. The heat was extraordinary, worse than anything he had experienced in 30 centuries of warfare, and he could feel his scales blackening and splitting as the fire tried to consume them both. But he did not move. He stayed wrapped around the girl until the worst of it had passed, until the flames moved on toward the creek where they would finally lose their strength, until the roaring faded to a crackling hiss and the air became breathable again. Katie was crying when he finally released her, her face streaked with ash and tears, her body trembling from fear and relief. "You saved me," she whispered, staring at his burned and broken form. "Why did you save me?" Zethkalor did not have an answer that made sense. In any language he knew, Ben arrived an hour later to find the sanctuary still standing, his daughter alive and unharmed, and the alien creature who had crashed into their lives collapsed in the yard, with burns covering most of his body. Emergency vehicles followed soon after, fire trucks and ambulances filling the dirt road that led to the Carter property. A young paramedic named Chris Palmer was the first to approach Zethkalor, and though his hands were shaking with obvious fear, he began treating the alien's wounds without hesitation. "You should be afraid of me," Zethkalor said through the pain. "I am a monster." Chris looked at him with steady eyes. "I do not see a monster," he said. "I see someone who got hurt helping people, and that makes you one of us." Ben knelt beside Zethkalor and put his hand on the alien's shoulder, the same shoulder he had bandaged weeks ago when they had first met. "Thank you," he said simply. "You are a good." Zethkalor wanted to correct him, wanted to explain that he was not a man and was certainly not good, wanted to remind them all that he had planned to kill them once and might still do so if given the chance. But as he lay there in the ash and the fading smoke, surrounded by humans who had every reason to fear him and instead chose to help him, he found that he could not speak the words, because for the first time in 3,000 years, he was not sure they were true. The Dominion ship descended through the clouds on a cold morning in late autumn, its dark hull cutting through the gray sky like a blade through flesh. Zethkalor had been expecting this moment for weeks, had felt it approaching with the certainty of a warrior who has spent 3,000 years learning to sense danger before it arrives. He stood at the edge of the Carter property and watched the vessel land in the field beyond the tree line, its engines scorching the frozen grass black. Ben and Katie stood behind him on the porch of their home, and he had told them to run, had ordered them to flee while they still had the chance, but they had refused. "We are not leaving you," Katie said with that stubborn fire in her eyes that reminded him of warriors he had known long ago. "Whatever this is, we face it together." Zethkalor did not have time to argue, because the ship's doors were already opening, and figures were emerging into the morning light, tall, dark, and terrible in their battle armor. There were 12 warriors in total, the best the Dominion had to offer, and at their head walked Commander Vetseral, the soldier Zeth Kalor had trained personally, the protege he had shaped into a perfect instrument of conquest. "Master," Vetseral said as he approached, using the old title that Zeth Kalor had earned through centuries of bloodshed. "We have been searching for you since your ship went silent. We feared you were dead." "As you can see, I am not dead." Vetseral's eyes moved past Zeth Kalor to the two humans standing on the porch, and his expression shifted into something cold and calculating. "Witnesses," he said. "The protocol is clear. They must be cleansed. There will be no cleansing here." The words left Zeth Kalor's mouth before he fully understood what he was saying. But once they were spoken, he knew they were true, knew them in a way he had never known anything in his long existence. Vetseral's head tilted slightly, a gesture of confusion that Zeth Kalor recognized from their decades of service together. "I do not understand, Master. These are primitives. Their deaths mean nothing. This is standard procedure for contact with undeveloped species." "I will not allow it." "Will not allow?" Vetseral stepped closer, his armored form towering even over Zeth Kalor's considerable height. "You are the dragon of Neth Prime. You have cleansed 200 worlds without hesitation. You taught me that mercy is weakness, and weakness is death. Why would you spare these creatures?" Zeth Kalor thought about the question, thought about how to explain something that he barely understood himself. "I have spent months among them," he said finally. "I have watched them care for creatures that cannot repay them. I have seen them run into fires to save strangers. I have witnessed them weep over dying birds and build ramps for old men who cannot walk and sit with the sick so they do not die alone." Vetseral laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the frozen field. "These are weaknesses, Master, not virtues. You have been contaminated by their primitive thinking." "No," Zeth Kalor said, and his voice carried a weight that made even the warriors behind Vetseral shift uncomfortably. "I have been shown something we never learned, something our people forgot long ago, if we ever knew it at all." He pointed back at Ben and Katie without looking away from his former student. "They showed me kindness when they should have left me to die. They healed my wounds when they had every reason to fear me. They treated me as a friend when I had done nothing to deserve it. They are weak. No, they are not weak. They are something else entirely. They have discovered a strength we never imagined. They choose to be kind when cruelty would be easier. They sacrifice for strangers. They love things that cannot love them back." Zeth Kalor stepped forward until he was face to face with Vetseral, close enough to see the disgust forming in his protege's eyes. "They are not weak. They are brave in ways we have never learned to be, and I will not let you harm them." Vetseral was silent for a long moment, and then he sighed with something that might have been disappointment. "Then you have become what we always despised. You have become soft, and softness cannot be permitted in a warrior of the Dominion." He raised his hand, and the 12 warriors behind him drew their weapons, plasma rifles humming with deadly energy. "Kill them all," Vetseral commanded. "The Master has fallen to contamination. He must be cleansed along with the primitives." Zeth Kalor moved faster than thought. His hand found the blade at his hip, the ceremonial weapon he had carried for 3,000 years, and it sang through the air with a sound like screaming. Metal. The first 2 warriors fell before anyone understood what was happening. Zeth Kalor had trained Vetseral, had trained every warrior in this squad, had written the combat manuals they memorized, and designed the formations they used. He knew every weakness, every blind spot, every hesitation in their fighting style, and he was still the dragon of Neth Prime. The battle was brutal and brief, fought in the space between heartbeats, a blur of blade and claw and armor-piercing strikes that left bodies scattered across the frozen ground. Vetseral was the last to fall. His plasma rifle shattered, his armor cracked, Zethkalor's blade pressed against his throat. "How?" Vetsaral gasped. "How can you betray everything we are for these primitives?" Zethkalor looked back at the porch, where Ben and Katie stood, watching with wide eyes. The humans who had saved his life and shown him mercy, and asked for nothing in return. "Showed me that what we are is not all we can be," he said, "because strength without compassion is just cruelty with a better reputation, because I have seen a better way to live, and I will not go back to the darkness." He withdrew his blade and stepped away from his fallen protege. "Return to the Dominion," he said. "Tell them the dragon is dead. Tell them he died defending primitives who were not worth saving. Tell them whatever you wish." Vetsaral struggled to his feet, hatred burning in his eyes. "They will send more. They will never stop hunting you. You will never be safe." "Perhaps," Zethkalor said, "but I have something worth protecting now, and that makes all the difference." Vetsaral limped back to his ship, the lone survivor of a squad that had expected easy victory, and the vessel rose into the gray sky and disappeared into the clouds without another word. Katie found Zethkalor standing among the bodies of his former comrades, his scales covered in blood that was both his own and theirs, his blade still clutched in his shaking hand. She did not scream or run away. Instead, she walked up to him and began wrapping bandages around his wounds, just as she had done on the first night they met, just as her father had taught her to do for anything that was hurt. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for choosing us." Zethkalor had no words to offer. He simply stood there in the cold morning light, bleeding and broken and changed forever, and let the human girl care for him as though he were worth saving. The Dominion declared Zethkalor a traitor on the day the first winter snow fell across the Montana mountains. His name, once spoken with fear and reverence across 200 conquered worlds, became a curse among his people, a warning to others who might consider abandoning the path of strength. Execution orders were broadcast on all Nethari frequencies, promising glory and reward to any warrior who brought back his head. Zethkalor heard these broadcasts on the damaged communication equipment he had salvaged from his crashed ship, and he listened to his own death sentence with a peace he had never known before. He did not care what the Dominion thought of him anymore. He had found something better than glory, something more valuable than conquest, something that filled the empty spaces in his ancient heart that he had not even known were there. He chose to stay on Earth. Ben helped him build a small dwelling at the edge of the sanctuary. Property, a structure that combined Nethari design principles with human construction techniques, and it became his home in a way that no ship or barracks had ever been. He learned to care for the animals, though he complained constantly about the inefficiency of keeping creatures that served no tactical purpose. The three-legged dog became his particular responsibility after Ben noticed that the animal followed Zethkalor everywhere, sleeping outside his door at night and greeting him each morning with that ridiculous wagging tail. "He is tactically useless," Zethkalor would grumble while scratching behind the dog's ears. "He cannot hunt or guard or serve any meaningful function." "He loves you," Katie would reply with a knowing smile. "That is his function." The years passed in ways that Zethkalor had never experienced before, filled with small moments rather than great battles, with quiet joys rather than conquest. He watched Katie graduate from her educational institution and sat in the audience, surrounded by humans who stared at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. And he felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with victory in combat. A young man arrived at the sanctuary before a celebration called prom to escort Katie to a dance, and Zethkalor answered the door himself, his full 7 feet of scarred scales and burning eyes filling the entrance. The boy nearly fainted, which Zethkalor considered an excellent outcome, and Katie laughed so hard she had to sit down while her date trembled in the doorway. "Be good to her," Zethkalor said to the terrified young man, "or I will find you." The boy brought Katie home exactly on time and was unfailingly polite for the rest of their brief relationship. Word of the Montana Dragon began to spread beyond Earth, carried in whispered transmissions across the galaxy by traders and travelers who had heard the impossible stories. The legendary executioner, who had burned worlds without mercy, living among primitives, caring for animals, defending creatures weaker than himself. Other Nethari began making secret pilgrimages to this backwater planet, curious about the warrior who had abandoned everything for a species that had not even reached the stars. They came expecting to find Zethkalor broken or enslaved or driven mad by his isolation from his own kind. Instead, they found him teaching astronomy to human children at the local library, his terrible claws pointing out constellations, while young ones sat cross-legged on the floor, asking questions without any trace of fear. "That one is Orion," he would say in his rumbling voice. "Your ancestors named it after a hunter, but my people call it the Wounded Warrior, because see how the stars there form the shape of someone falling?" Some of the Nethari visitors left disgusted by what they saw, certain that their former hero had lost his mind. Others stayed. They watched him walk through the town, nodding to humans who greeted him by name, stopping to help an elderly woman carry her packages, kneeling down to speak with children who wanted to touch his scales. They watched him sit with Ben on the porch in the evenings, drinking something called coffee and talking about nothing in particular, while the sun set behind the mountains. They watched him live a life that had no place in the Dominion's understanding of existence, and some of them began to wonder if there might be more to strength than they had been taught. A young Nethari warrior named Kethvora was the first to ask Zethkalor to teach her what he had learned. "I want to understand," she said, standing in his doorway with uncertainty written across her features. "I want to know why you gave up everything for this." Zethkalor looked at her for a long moment, remembering when he had been young and certain, and blind to anything beyond. "Conquest. I did not give up anything," he said finally. "I found something that is very different." He invited her inside and introduced her to the three-legged dog and made her something called tea, and he began to tell her about Ben Carter, who healed broken things, and Katie, who talked to monsters, and Danny Cole, who ran into fires for strangers, and Amy Dawson, who held the hands of the dying. More Nethari came after Kethvora, drawn by rumors of the dragon who had learned to be gentle, and Zethkalor welcomed each one. Not all of them understood, and not all of them stayed, but those who did carried something new back to the stars with them, a seed of doubt about everything they had been taught to believe. 30 years after his crash landing, Zethkalor sat down to record his final log entry. His scales had faded from pure obsidian to a softer gray, and his movements were slower than they once had been, but his eyes still burned with the fire of someone who had found his purpose. "I was the dragon of Neth Prime," he spoke into the recording device, his voice steady and calm. "I burned worlds without regret. I believed mercy was weakness and weakness was death. Then I met a man who saved animals no one wanted, a girl who talked to monsters, and a species that chose compassion when hatred would have been justified." He paused, looking out the window at the sanctuary where Ben, now white-haired and slow, was feeding the animals as he did every morning. "They did not defeat me with weapons. They defeated me with casseroles and bandages and the stubborn insistence that everyone deserves a second chance." Katie appeared in the doorway, a grown woman now with children of her own, who called Zethkalor uncle and climbed on his shoulders without fear. "I have lived beside humans for 30 of their years," he continued. "I have learned their songs and their stories. I have held their hands when they were dying, and celebrated when their children were born. I have become something my people have no word for." He smiled, an expression that would have terrified anyone who had known him in his former life, but now simply looked like what it was. I have become kind, and I am not weaker for it. I am finally, after 3,000 years of darkness, strong enough to be gentle. He ended the recording, and walked outside to join Ben in feeding the animals, the three-legged dog limping happily at his heels. The humans have a saying, he had told Kethbora before she left to spread his teachings among the stars. It takes more courage to spare a life than to take one. I did not understand this when I arrived. I understand it now. He was the dragon of Neth Prime, and he had found his home among creatures who should have feared him and instead chose to love him. And if the Dominion ever came for them again, they would learn what it meant to face a dragon who finally had something worth protecting.